Welcome to the Mind.
What do we really mean by genius?
Matters.
Giftedness is so much more than an academic label.
Podcast.
We tend to think of gifted as kids being good at everything across the board.
An exploration of giftedness.
Originals are nonconformists.
Creativity.
People who not only have new ideas.
Intelligence.
They're the people you want to bet on.
In childhood.
I like to learn about things, but I like to learn my way.
And beyond. This is the Mind Matters Podcast.
Welcome to episode 45. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. Today we are talking about executive functioning skills with our guest, Brendan Mahan. He is an ADHD executive functioning consultant, a speaker, a veteran educator, and he happens to host his own podcast called ADHD Essentials. I think that you'll really enjoy this interview. We will discuss how educators, parents, and counselors can help kids learn self-regulation skills, some of the extra challenges of neuro-diverse people regarding this skill development, and tools and techniques educators can use to help students grow. Quick reminder that between now and the release of our next episode, the NAGC annual convention is taking place in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I will be in attendance and presenting a few sessions. So if you're going, be sure to look me up. And finally, if you like Mind Matters, we ask that you tell the world by leaving a review in Apple iTunes or whatever platform you use to get your podcasts. Give us a thumbs up and a few kind words, and that really goes a long way. Today's guest.
My name is Brendan Mahan. I'm an ADHD coach, consultant, and speaker. I'm also the host of the ADHD Essentials podcast. And so, yeah, ADHD is kind of my jam.
Coming up next.
Previously on Mind Matters.
I think that there is an understanding that we need to move away from ideas such as global giftedness, that we're looking for high ability across educational and ability domains. Mental health professionals are oftentimes experts in diagnostics, whereas educators are the experts in identifying talent domains. And unless we're talking across disciplines, we're not going to have the most accurate picture for that student so that we can meet both their talent domain needs as well as their disability needs.
That's episode 44. Look for it wherever you get your podcasts. This is the Mind Matters Podcast.
With us today is Brendan Mahan. He is the host of the ADHD Essentials podcast, and he's also the father of twin 10-year-old sons who have ADHD. You might want to make a note. I'm going to be a guest on his podcast in the next week or so be sure to look for it if you don't already subscribe. So, Brendan, what would you say attracted you to the issue of ADHD and executive dysfunction? Was it your kids, or was it through your own experiences?
It was through mine, yeah. So I have ADHD, and I was a teacher for 8 years. And in the course of teaching, I struggled for a couple of reasons. One, I was an English teacher, and that's a lot of grading. Like having 100 essays to grade is not a fun experience. So I definitely struggled on sort of the organizational side of being a teacher. But even more significantly, what made it hard for me was that I was teaching when budgets were weak. So in education, last one in, first one out, I just kept getting cut, and I wasn't keeping a job for more than a year or two. And eventually that became debilitating because I hadn't kept a curriculum long enough to feel like I knew what I was doing with it. And so when I lost my 5th job in 7 years, I was like, I got to go do something else. And I already had a master's degree in education, but people kept telling me I should be a guidance counselor. And so when I left the classroom, my 2 goals were become a guidance counselor or become an ADHD coach, because I had recently become diagnosed with ADHD. A big part of my leaving education and my struggle there was difficulty with the organizational side of education. And that led me to pursue that ADHD diagnosis. So I was sort of like finding out what ADHD was, and that it was much more complicated than I thought it was as a teacher, that it's not just behavior. But I also came to understand that I knew it intuitively and could explain it really well. The clinician I was working with was like, you understand this in a way that someone who doesn't have ADHD can't, and you explain it better than most people I've met, and I work with ADHD people professionally.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of pushed me in the direction of being an ADHD coach. And I ended up doing both, where I got the master's in school counseling. So I have 2 of those. I'm one of the few people with ADHD that's found success in higher education. Most of us struggle there. But I got that master's in guidance counseling, and I also started dabbling in the world of ADHD as a profession, thinking that would be a huge benefit to my guidance counseling pursuit. But it wasn't, which was surprising to me because everyone thought that ADHD was just special education and weren't seeing the benefit of having an expert in ADHD on their guidance counseling team. And since there's not a lot of guidance counseling openings in general, because there's 1, maybe 2 or 3 in a given school, it was hard for me to get that job. And I ended up heading in the direction of ADHD instead, with some side treks into both special education and also mental health counseling through DCF.
I have a kind of a similar career path where I started in education and I got my master's in gifted education and then went back and got a second master's in counseling and family therapy. It sounds like maybe for some similar reasons where I felt like kids needed and wanted more. So I was diagnosed as a kid, but it sounds like you were diagnosed as an adult. When you reflect back on your childhood years, do you see a lot of those struggles and think about like what might have been different if you had known what was going on at that time?
I don't.
No?
I mean, I see the struggles, right? I absolutely see the struggles, but I don't necessarily think about how things would be different because it just isn't a useful exercise. And also because if things were different, I wouldn't be where I am now and I wouldn't be the person that I am now. And those struggles, as much as they sucked, helped me a lot. And I learned a lot of really valuable lessons out of it, and they've really defined me as a person. And I'm pretty happy with who I am. So I wouldn't want things to magically become easier because I got the help I needed way back when, because then I wouldn't have the resilience and the compassion that I have now, having gone through those challenging times.
So now you're in this position where you're supporting students and families in a much different role than when you were in the classroom. What do you feel like are some of the things that you see the most often with kids who are struggling with executive functioning?
Emotional regulation and management is a big challenge for kids with executive functioning difficulties, because the difficulties of ADHD and executive dysfunction leads to so much shame and frustration. And then that plays out potentially in anger and anxiety and sadness and really strong emotions. So learning how to manage that and navigate that is critical for my clients. And working backwards from there, it comes to the parents and working with them around communication skills and skills around connection and forgiveness and understanding about the challenges that their kids face, and probably the challenges the parents have faced or are facing as well, because ADHD is hereditary. So one of those parents likely has ADHD too.
Can you elaborate on that forgiveness piece?
I can, yeah. When it comes to elevated emotion, right? When the meltdown or the fit or whatever you want to call it, right? All that really is dysregulated emotions. They're just emotions that are not in control and are negative and disruptive, because we can have dysregulated happiness all day and people typically don't care. They might be like, calm down, you're a little excited, but that's about it. But dysregulated anger, dysregulated sadness, dysregulated anxiety, that stuff tends to be more disruptive, and we tend to care more about the fact that it's happening because it kind of causes a problem somewhere. It either slows us down or it prevents something from happening.
Mm-hmm.
Navigating that is important. And what I typically look at when it comes to that, I typically think of it as anxiety. So that anxiety burst is oftentimes when a kid gets upset, they're getting upset because they've caused a problem. And in the solving of that problem, we don't always look at it in a way that is useful. So if the kid has caused a problem and now they're upset about it, that problem probably happened because the kid lacks some skills. Because if they didn't lack skills, they wouldn't have caused the problem. So now the problem happens and the kid's upset, the teacher or the mom or the dad are upset, whoever, people are upset. And oftentimes we jump from that escalation, that fight, flight, and freeze mode, straight to solving the problem. And it's not useful because we're saying to the kid, well, you're going to do this, this, and this. When the kid is upset and can't really hear the logical stuff we're talking about because they're stuck in their emotional brain.
Right.
So the parent or the teacher, the adult, is often kind of in their prefrontal cortex, right? The part of their brain that can make careful decisions. But the kid is in the amygdala. The kid is in this more primal part of the brain that's more emotionally driven and is really focused on, am I safe? Am I not safe?
Mm-hmm.
And so when mom or dad or the teacher says, well, you're just going to study this much and do these things and then everything will be okay. If the kid is in full amygdala, they can't hear it anyway. They're not going to remember what you said. So you got to wait till they calm down. And if they're kind of doing a prefrontal cortex amygdala combination of thought, then they might hear what you're saying, but it ends up feeling contingent. It ends up feeling like, well, I feel disconnected from you because I just got upset and you're not even addressing the fact that I was upset. You're just talking about how I have to fix this thing I did wrong. And clearly you're still mad at me because if you weren't mad at me, you would have forgiven me. And now I have to solve this problem, but I don't know how to solve that problem because if I knew how to solve that problem, I wouldn't have caused the problem in the first place because it's a lack of skills.
Right.
And I'm not going to go to mom or dad or my teacher for that solution because I haven't been forgiven, because I feel like they're still mad at me.
They expect that.
Yeah. And so it's critical that when a problem arises, particularly one that is emotionally charged, it's critical that we talk to our kids about how it's okay and we forgive them. And then we try to have them fix it and help them if necessary. But if we don't do that forgiveness part, they're never going to feel safe in getting our help.
Yeah, we have to let them know that the forgiveness isn't contingent on the fixing of the problem.
Right.
Forgiveness comes first. I think that's a really big thing for those kids. And I think you're right, though, because so many kids who struggle with executive functioning, they do constantly feel like they're in trouble or they're about to get in trouble or they're not good enough, and those things that really becomes internalized for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know it did for me, and it still kind of does. I still have times as a 42-year-old adult where I'm feeling like I'm in trouble and I did something wrong and I didn't. I there's no one for me to be in trouble to, but I'm still deeply worried about it.
You mentioned specifically ADHD and, how that's connected with executive functioning. But one of the things that I notice with a lot of my clients is that executive functioning is not exclusive to an ADHD diagnosis. Do you see kids coming in with other diagnoses or perhaps no diagnosis at all who are struggling with these things?
I do. I don't really care what your diagnosis is. I just care what the problems are and whether or not I can help. So I've worked with kids on the autism spectrum, typically high-functioning kids, typically with a comorbid ADHD diagnosis. I've worked with a handful of clients who had like brain injuries, concussion stuff, nothing too severe, but sort of repeated concussions or one significant concussion where I've helped them to kind of navigate those challenges because executive functions are everywhere. They're sort of the building blocks of adult success is those executive functions. So many of my clients are struggling with adult success if they're adults, right? So their job stuff or relationship stuff is challenging for them. Or if they're in middle school and high school or even college, it's usually their parents kind of going, they're not progressing at the rate that I would like them to progress. They're struggling in areas that they shouldn't struggle. And so I kind of come in to help shore up some of those skills and to teach them as skills, which is different from how most parents approach things. They'll figure it out. Like my kid will just watch me do the laundry and then they'll magically know how to do the laundry. You got to teach that.
Right. There are some kids who do tend to pick up on these skills somehow by osmosis. I was not one of those kids. My children are not those kids. So I don't really know how that happens. I just know that it does. But I feel like if you expect that, though, you do get in that cycle of frustration. Why aren't you doing this? But it's like if you just kind of pause and take that minute, like, okay, what's not connecting here?
Yeah, and it's also a time factor too, right? Like there's plenty of parents who it would be way more convenient if their kid could watch them boil spaghetti or whatever and magically learn how to do that, because part of why we want our kids to be able to do that stuff is to save us time, because as adults, we're slammed. We're doing way too much. But teaching our kids those skills is worth the time investment, because we're fostering independence for them by teaching them these skills. We're getting some quality time with them, even if they're annoyed the whole time. And in the long run, the half an hour it takes to teach them how to do the laundry over the course of 5 or 6 days is going to save us hours of time in the long run. So even if you're only looking at it in terms of a time swap, it's still beneficial. But kids need that guidance. They need a sage every now and then. And it's okay for us to be that. We're their parents. We're kind of supposed to play that role.
You mentioned that emotional regulation, and I feel like that's one of those characteristics that goes along with executive functioning that a lot of people don't always make that connection. Are there other characteristics or signs of executive dysfunction that you feel like are under-recognized? I think a lot of times people think about being organized or, keeping things in order. What are some of the others that maybe people are less aware of?
Time awareness is huge. For me, a minute is not always a minute and an hour is not always an hour. And that's kind of true for everybody. Like, we all have a story of like that time you met that amazingly interesting person in high school or college and you had an hour-long conversation with them. And somehow in that hour, the sun went down and came back up again. And it's amazing that it's tomorrow. And wow, that conversation was so deep and engaging. Or you get that first job and you're there for like 3 hours and you go up to your boss and you're like, hey boss, I know that I get to take a break now because I read the employee manual for the one and only time I'm ever going to do that. And it said that after 3 hours, I got a break. And your boss was like, you've been here for 40 minutes. What are you talking about? Mm-hmm. That stuff happens to everybody. And plenty of your listeners have stories like that. I don't have stories like that because that's just normal for me. That's all the time. And so I have to use a lot of outside strategies to be aware of how much time is going past. I look at the clock all the time, especially when I'm on my computer. I'm constantly glancing. What time is it? How much time has gone by? What do I need to do next? I have a calendar that I use to keep me in line with the time of my day. Mm-hmm. That's all because I know that my time awareness stinks. And the same is true for my kids. My wife's is pretty good. But it's a challenge. You do something that's really engaging and it feels like you've been doing it for 5 minutes. It turns out you've been working on this thing for 3 hours and now you don't have time to eat lunch, or you're going to be late to your uncle's house for the family reunion or whatever the case may be. You lose time because you're engaged with something. Mm-hmm. And we also tend to conflate emotions with time too a lot. A good example of that is we have this like big picture window in our living room. We have like a huge curtain, and like happens sometimes, the curtain rod kind of, not the rod, but the anchors to the wall. One of them sort of fell out. It just kind of gave up the ghost and started falling out. So the curtain rod was tipping off the wall a little bit. And my wife was like, can you fix that? And I'm like, sure thing. But I was doing something else when she mentioned it to me, and I have ADHD, so I forgot. And it looked okay with a passing glance. You kind of had to look carefully to know that there's something wrong. And so it just wasn't a thing I was aware of. So it was only when my wife reminded me to do it that I even remembered I should. And typically that happened at a time when I couldn't. It would be like, can you fix that tonight? Sure thing, I'll fix that tonight. And then tonight comes and I do something else. So months and months and months went by with me not doing anything to fix this. It might have even been a year. I don't know. Time is weird, like I've already said. And eventually she just took the curtain rod off that little anchor thing to the wall and put it on the ground, but only one side. So now the curtain is like half of it is up at the top of the window and the other half is on the ground. And now it's obvious, right? So I fixed it that day. Now I see it. But when I considered how long it was going to take me to do that, I was like, this is like a 3-hour job. It took me, by the way, 15 minutes. But the reason it felt like a 3-hour job was because I had all kinds of guilt and shame wrapped up in that task because I hadn't done it. Mm-hmm. And those of us with ADHD, with autism, with executive function disorder, we often conflate the time and effort that a task is going to take and the guilt and shame that revolves around having not done it.
Yeah.
Or the excitement for having to do it, right? Like there's stuff that is great to do that I really dig. And I'm like, yeah, no, I'll bang this out in 5 minutes. And it takes me an hour and a half, but I genuinely thought it was going to be 5 minutes because I had so much excitement around doing it. The more I want to do something, the less time I think it's going to take. The less I want to do something, the more time I think it'll take. So one of the things I do is I time how long it takes me to do stuff just to develop that time wisdom. Like I know it takes me about 45 minutes to mow my front yard and about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes to mow my backyard, which means mowing my entire yard is about a 2-hour experience. And that's good for me to know because until I timed that, I thought mowing my lawn was like an all-day project.
Right.
But it isn't. It's not even a half-a-day project.
You know, that makes me think of something. I feel like a lot of times people who have executive functioning struggles, it's this constant mitigation of like, what do I have to do that people are going to see or know? Like for me personally, the time that my house gets cleaned is when there are people going to be at my house within the next 3 hours. Like that's when I really go through and do that. It's very difficult to kind of manage that at other times.
That's why you invite people over.
That's true. That is why we do that. Don't tell anybody. Don't tell my mom.
She probably had the same thing. That's probably why she invited people over.
It was actually my dad, I think, more than my mom, but yes.
So he'll hear this and be like, she figured me out.
Yeah. But you know, it's like, what do you think are other things that get in the way? Because I think people just go, oh, I'm just procrastinating or but it's more than that. Wouldn't you say?
No, it's the wall of awful.
So explain the wall of awful.
Really, it's a trauma model. And so I'll walk you through it briefly. Some of the people who know me are going to be like, he's talking about that again, but it's everywhere, guys. And those of you who don't know me, you're going to go, that's really cool. I'm glad you just talked about it. So the wall of awful it extends beyond ADHD. Everybody has a wall of awful. People with ADHD, because they fail more, have larger walls and have more of them. The wall of awful is built when we fail. So every time we fail, we get a little brick in our wall as it relates to the specific task that we failed on. And along with that failure brick, we get a disappointment brick because we disappointed ourselves. And we also get a disappointment brick for everyone whose opinion of us matters as it relates to that task. So if I'm a kid and I don't do my math homework, I get a failure brick for not having done that math assignment. I also get a disappointment brick for myself, one for mom, one for dad, and one for my teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And we also get a rejection brick for all of those people who we assume we have disappointed.
Right.
And it doesn't matter if those people really disappoint us, and it doesn't matter if they really reject us. It's about our perception, not what really happens.
Mm-hmm.
So it's possible to get in there quick and forgive that kid. We're back to that forgiveness stuff. For having missed that math assignment, let them know it's not a big deal. They haven't missed an assignment in like 2 months. Don't sweat it, right? But we have to get in immediately upon them realizing that they didn't do their math homework. If an hour goes by, it's too late. Then we have to work harder, and we're not going to keep the bricks out. We can just make them a little smaller or make them a little weaker, and maybe they'll fall out later. But they're still going to land.
Mm.
And along with those disappointment and rejection and failure bricks, we also get guilt because I feel bad that I made the mistake. Shame if I feel like I am the mistake, because that's kind of the difference there is guilt is I feel like I made a mistake. Shame is I feel like I am the mistake. And if I made the mistake because I have ADHD or because I have a memory challenge,
Mm-hmm.
then how do I tease those two things out? How do I keep the guilt from becoming shame? One of the things I advise my clients to do is just say sometimes the ADHD wins, because sometimes it does, and you got to accept it. That's the only way to move past the challenges and avoid the shame and hold the guilt instead, because guilt goes away, shame doesn't. But we also get loneliness bricks and fear and anxiety and all kinds of other bricks, and sometimes really big blocks start to show up as we fail in the same area of life over and over and over again.
Right.
It's a wall of trauma. That's what it is. It's this big wall of negative emotions. And so then when we need to initiate a task, we have to navigate that wall. We have to get past it. And there's 5 ways people do it. 2 don't work. 1 works, but is unhealthy, and 2 work. So the 2 that don't work are staring at it because you're just staring at it. You're not actually engaged with anything. You're just looking at it and going around it. Going around it also doesn't work because typically we get distracted and do something else, right? Like, oh, I'll just watch this episode of Bob's Burgers and then I'll do my homework. And then another episode of Bob's Burgers comes on and 2 hours later, you're still watching Bob's Burgers.
Right.
The strategy that works but is unhealthy is to smash your way through the wall of awful. That's the kid who's like, fine, I'll do my math. God, shut up. Right? Or they flip the hood up and they kind of sulk and they're like, what's wrong with me? Why do I suck? And then eventually they do it. Both of those are activating dopamine in the brain, which is what makes us want to do stuff. It's just using negative emotions to activate that dopamine. So you're doing damage either to your relationship with the person asking you to do the homework or with yourself. So it's not as useful as it could be. It's useful in getting the assignment done, but long-term, it's a bad plan. And those three strategies of smashing, going around it, and staring at it are the body's stress response. That's fight, flight, and freeze. The other options are to climb the wall or to put a door in it. And climbing it is often looked at as procrastination. What might be going on is we might just be sitting with those negative emotions and navigating them internally and getting ourselves emotionally ready to do our homework or to mow the lawn or to ask someone out on a date. We're not necessarily procrastinating. Sometimes we're doing a lot of internal emotional work that just can't be seen from the outside and that we might not even be aware of. So we might think we're procrastinating when we aren't. So things like mindfulness are good for helping us climb it. Knowing what our walls of awful are, that's great for climbing it. Building in ADHD-friendly strategies can make the climb easier. So things like calendars and timers and that kind of stuff. Having the tools that you need at hand so you're not drifting around the house looking for a stapler. And then putting a door in it is just changing your emotional state so that you can get through the wall because the wall is made of emotions and they're all negative. So if I can change my emotional state to one of confidence and surety, then I can get through that wall more easily. That's a good example of that is when you're like, I'm going to go to the gym. I'm going to go to the gym. Yep, I am no closer to the gym now than I was when I started saying this 3 days ago. What's going on? But then someone turns on the Eye of the Tiger and you can't get out of the house fast enough to get to the gym because that song triggers an emotional response and it shifts your emotional state and now you're ready to exercise. So whatever we can do to change our emotional state can help us get through that wall quicker. Just put a door in it and pop through. Even podcasts are great for that. If I need to be productive, I listen to all kinds of podcasts of successful people talking about being amazing because it makes me want to be amazing too. So that's the wall of awful in a nutshell.
I was thinking as you were describing that, in each of those little bricks, that sometimes there are parents or teachers who are perhaps misguided or just don't really understand what that executive functioning is. And I almost envision those adults handing the child a brick, trying to use it as a tool, like, here, you should feel shame for this. You should feel bad that you didn't get this done. Like somehow that's going to motivate them.
And it doesn't.
It's counterintuitive.
One of the things I've been seeing on social media lately is a bulletin board that says, this is the person responsible for your attitude, comments, decisions, grades, success. And there's a mirror. And it makes me want to scream because I'm like, attitude, maybe.
Yeah.
Decisions, okay. Comments, words, okay. Success, nope. Grades, nope. That's just not the case because when I was 10, 15, 16, 20, my grades are also determined by my professor. My success is affected by my parents, my neighbors, my friends. I am not the only person who controls that stuff for me. Even as a 42-year-old adult, I'm not the only one responsible for my success. My wife plays a role in it. My kids play a role in it. My coworkers and other folks in the ADHD world that help me or choose not to. All of that plays a role in how successful I am. And that's true for everybody. No one is independently successful.
Yeah.
Or unsuccessful. And so those bulletin boards drive me crazy because they're great for the kid who has a very supportive family and is doing really well and doesn't need to see that bulletin board. And they're destructive for the most vulnerable students.
Yeah.
And those I suspect are the kids that they're trying to motivate with that bulletin board.
You mentioned something, you just said it, and you said, those are great for the kids who basically don't need it. So both of my older kids are diagnosed with ADHD. And just recently, my daughter, they do class Dojo in their classroom. And it makes me want to scream a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. She came home and she was very excited because she goes, Mom, I get to bring gum to class tomorrow. I said, oh, okay. And she was kind of telling me about it. She goes, yeah, I finally got enough Dojo points. And then the conversation went on and she said, she has the fewest number of Dojo points of anyone in her entire class. Mm-hmm. She shouldn't know that.
She shouldn't know that.
And ultimately, what are you trying to teach her? What is she internalizing about herself? And if you're really trying to change her behavior or help her build those lagging skills, Dojo is not the way to do it.
I can see Classroom Dojo working if you frame it properly.
Yes, I agree.
If you work really hard at the head game of Classroom Dojo and the success mindset that you're trying to instill and the growth mindset that you're trying to instill, I can see it working. But you have to be doing that just about every day, certainly 3 to 4 times a week in the classroom on purpose, intentionally. Mm-hmm. But if you just launch it in the beginning of the year and then you don't talk about it too much after that, and you just kind of hope it's going to be this self-sustaining process, it's just going to damage the kids who are most vulnerable, like your daughter having the fewest number of points. There's a couple ways she could know that, right? One is there might be a scorecard somewhere on the website for Classroom Dojo, and so she definitively knows for sure she has the fewest points. Mm-hmm. That's unacceptable. That shouldn't be a thing. On the other hand, if she knows this because she's talking to her friends and they all tell her how many points she has and all this kind of stuff, that's a thing that teachers should be ahead of. They should be saying, you might talk to your friends and they might tell you that they have X number of points. They may or may not be right about that. So don't believe for a second that you have the fewest points out of everybody or just out of your friends, because sometimes kids misremember. Sometimes kids make up their totals to make themselves sound good and feel good. And if they're doing that, that's okay. They just need a boost that day. But that doesn't mean that you are the bottom of the barrel. Mm-hmm. If you are worried that you're the bottom of the barrel, come talk to me and we'll go over your points together. And then when that kid comes to talk to you about their points, as the teacher, you say, you look at the screen that they can't see and you say, I can tell you for sure that you're not at the bottom of the list. Here are what your points. This is what you got your points for. And here's what you can do if you want to have a higher total. But you're not at the bottom. Even if that kid is at the bottom, you still lie to them and tell them that they're not. And if you want to use it as a motivating tool and you want everyone to see everybody's points, maybe there's a way to have those points shift around enough so that everyone's always in the middle. I don't know.
It's hard when, and I get it. I mean, I was in the classroom, and you were in the classroom. I mean, it is hard to manage behavior. Those types of programs, they work for the kids who don't always need them if they're not framed correctly.
I know I never had this perspective as a teacher. I thought of the kid as like, that kid just isn't doing it right. That kid's not getting good grades. That kid isn't behaving or can't behave or whatever. That was kind of the language that I was using in my head. And since coming out of teaching and moving into more of a mental health realm and certainly a neuro-diverse realm, now I think of those kids as vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And that's a very different perspective to have, because now it's not that the kid doesn't want to do it. It's that outside forces are affecting that kid in a way that is not healthy for them. They are vulnerable to stuff outside of them. Because I operate under the assumption now that everybody wants to succeed. Everybody wants to do well. Everyone has good intentions. And if for some reason you are not succeeding or you are not treating people well, it's because you're missing something. You have some unmet need that has to be addressed.
So, Brendan, as we kind of wrap up our conversation, is there like one topic that like you feel like parents and educators, if they just knew this thing, it would help a lot of these kids?
Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs. Kids and adults who are struggling have unmet needs. At the bottom, it's biological stuff, right? I haven't had enough to eat. I'm not getting enough sleep. I don't have shelter, that kind of stuff. Just above that is safety. Do I feel safe? Shelter plays a role there as well. Am I being bullied? Am I economically insecure, so I don't know if I'm going to be able to eat tomorrow even though I ate today? Or I don't know if I'm going to get kicked out of my house or my apartment. And then above safety is belongingness. Do I feel connected? And do I feel like I belong socially to my town, my school, my friend group, my family? After those three things, we finally get to like esteem needs, which is where school lives. Am I getting good grades? Am I doing well? Am I being successful? There's a lot of stuff that has to get met before we get to academics. And then on top of that is like self-actualization stuff that I'm not totally sure I buy into, but that's like sort of, am I living my best, fullest life? Really digging into those needs and looking at where you are, where your kid is, and where your students are especially, and using that to help understand why they struggle with the things they struggle with, it'll start to make sense. My kid right now, my boys are in middle school. Their friend groups are shifting and changing. Of course, homework is not important to them and academics don't matter. They're becoming connected to a new group and they're finding a new measure of belongingness in that new group, and that matters more. So looking at the world through that perspective of Maslow's hierarchy of needs has been pretty useful for me, and I think it could be useful for others.
Brendan Mahan, host of the ADHD Essentials podcast. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Emily.
Executive dysfunction is not limited to individuals with ADHD. It can be related to a wide range of neurological diagnoses, or perhaps none at all. The best way to help kids through this is by explicitly teaching them about executive functioning, how it impacts their daily lives, and what specific structures they can utilize in their daily lives to supplement their areas of struggle. In the executive functioning groups that we conduct at my office, Unlimited Potential Counseling and Education Center, we focus on metacognition to build skills by collecting data from daily experiences about what is working and what isn't, so the kids can test their own ideas about what will lead them to more success. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. See you next time on Mind Matters.
You gotta help me disappear from all those voices that I fear, and all the moments I couldn't handle 'cause I'm different. You have to promise to stay near. Oh, you're always telling me the truth. That's why I lean on you. You got the mind to see what's coming. You're my ears when I can't hear. You know what's right from wrong, what to say and what to wear. You know there's more than I can bear. You're always telling me the truth. That's why I lean on you. Just like you know that I always do. Oh, listen now, I'll never make it, so help me pull through. Whenever I've bitten off more than I can chew, that's when I lean on you.
Our thanks to Brendan Mahan for joining us today. If you'd like to add another great podcast to your subscriptions, check out ADHD Essentials. We'll put a link on the show notes page at mindmatterspodcast.com. Don't forget, if you have a little extra dough at the end of the month and you'd like to help support Mind Matters, you can go to patreon.com/mindmatters or find a link on our website. Mind Matters music is created by the amazing artists at Epidemic Sound. We thank them for sharing it with us. For Emily, our huge staff of sous chefs and bus people here at the Mind Matters complex, see, there they are. I'm executive producer Dave Morris. See you next time.
Oh, listen now, I'll never make it, so help me pull through. Whenever I've bitten off more than I can chew, that's when I lean on you.
Mind Matters is a production of Morris Creative Services.